Section 1, Part 3 of the Introduction to Timaeus. Timaeus, by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. Introduction and Analysis. Section 1, Part 3. Having now before us the causes out of which the rest of our discourse is to be framed, let us go back to the point at which we began, and add a fair ending to our tale. As I said at first, all things were originally a chaos, in which there was no order or proportion. The elements of this chaos were arranged by the Creator, and out of them he made the world. Of the divine he himself was the author, but he committed to his offspring the creation of the mortal. From him they received the immortal soul, but themselves made the body to be its vehicle, and constructed within another soul which was mortal, and subject to terrible affections, pleasure, the inciter of evil, pain, which deters from good, rashness and fear, foolish counselors, anger, hard to be appeased, hope, easily led astray. These they mingled with irrational sense and all-daring love, according to necessary laws, and so framed men. And fearing to pollute the divine element, they gave the mortal soul a separate habitation in the breast, parted off from the head by a narrow isthmus. And as in a house the women's apartments are divided from the men's, the cavity of the thorax was divided into two parts, a higher and a lower. The higher of the two, which is the seat of courage and anger, lies nearer to the head, between the midriff and the neck, and assists reason in restraining the desires. The heart is the house of guard, in which all the veins meet, and through them reason sends her commands to the extremity of her kingdom. When the passions are in revolt, or danger approaches from without, then the heart beats and swells, and the creating powers, knowing this, implanted in the body the soft and bloodless substance of the lung, having a porous and springy nature like a sponge, and being kept cool by drink and air which enters through the trachea. The part of the soul which desires meat and drink was placed between the midriff and navel, where they made a sort of manger, and here they bound it down, like a wild animal, away from the council chamber, and leaving the better principle undisturbed to advise quietly for the good of the whole. For the Creator knew that the belly would not listen to reason, and was under the power of idols and fancies. Wherefore he framed the liver to connect with the lower nature, contriving that it should be compact and bright and sweet, and also bitter and smooth, in order that the power of thought which originates in the mind might there be reflected, terrifying the belly with the elements of bitterness and gall, and a suffusion of bilious choles when the liver is contracted, and causing pain and misery by twisting out of its place the lobe, and closing up the vessels and gates. And the converse happens when some gentle inspiration, coming from intelligence, mirrors the opposite fancies, giving rest and sweetness and freedom, and at night moderation and peace, accompanied with prophetic insight, when reason and sense are asleep. For the authors of our being, in obedience to their Father's will, and in order to make men as good as they could, gave to the liver the power of divination, which is never active when men are awake or in health, but when they are under the influence of some disorder or enthusiasm, then they receive intimations, which have to be interpreted by others who are called prophets, but should rather be called interpreters of prophecy. After death, these intimations become unintelligible. The spleen, which is situated in the neighborhood on the left side, keeps the liver bright and clean, as a napkin does a mirror, and the evacuations of the liver are received into it, and being a hollow tissue, it is for a time swollen with these impurities, but when the body is purged, it returns to its natural size. The truth concerning the soul can only be established by the word of God. Still, we may venture to assert what is probable, both concerning soul and body. The creative powers were aware of our tendency to excess, and so, when they made the belly to be a receptacle for food, in order that men might not perish by insatiable gluttony, they formed the convolutions of the intestines, in this way retarding the passage of food through the body, lest mankind should be absorbed in eating and drinking, and the whole race become impervious to divine philosophy. The creation of bones and flesh was on this wise. The foundation of these is the marrow, which binds together body and soul, and the marrow is made out of such of the primary triangles as are adapted by their perfection to produce all the four elements. These God took and mingled them in due proportion, making as many kinds of marrow as there were hereafter to be kinds of souls. The receptacle of the divine soul he made round, and called that portion of the marrow brain, intending that the vessel containing the substance should be the head. The remaining part he divided into long and round figures, and to these, as to anchors fastening the mortal soul, he proceeded to make the rest of the body, first forming for both parts a covering of bone. The bone was formed by sifting pure smooth earth and wetting it with marrow. It was then thrust alternately into fire and water, and thus rendered insoluble by either. Of bone he made a globe, which he placed around the brain, leaving a narrow opening, and around the marrow of the neck and spine he formed the vertebrae, like hinges, which extended from the head through the whole of the trunk. And as the bone was brittle and liable to mortify and destroy the marrow by too great rigidity and susceptibility to heat and cold, he contrived sinews and flesh, the first to give flexibility, the second to guard against heat and cold, and to be a protection against falls, containing a warm moisture which in summer exudes and cools the body, and in winter is a defense against cold. Having this in view, the Creator mingled earth with fire and water, and mixed with them a ferment of acid and salt, so as to form pulpy flesh. But the sinews he made of a mixture of bone and unfermented flesh, giving them a mean nature between the two, and a yellow color. Hence they were more gluttonous than flesh, but softer than bone. The bones, which have most of the living soul within them, he covered with the thinnest film of flesh. Those which have least of it he lodged deeper. At the joints he diminished the flesh, in order not to impede the flexure of the limbs, and also to avoid clogging the perceptions of the mind. About the thighs and arms, which have no sense because there is little soul in the marrow, and about the inner bones, he laid the flesh thicker. For where the flesh is thicker, there is less feeling, except in certain parts which the Creator has made solely of flesh, as for example the tongue. Had the combination of solid bone and thick flesh been consistent with acute perceptions, the Creator would have given man a sinewy and fleshy head, and then he would have lived twice as long. But our creators were of opinion that a shorter life, which was better, was preferable to a longer, which was worse, and therefore they covered the head with thin bone, and placed the sinews at the extremity of the head round the neck, and fastened the jawbones to them below the face. And they framed the mouth, having teeth and tongue and lips, with a view to the necessary and the good, for food is a necessity, and the river of speech is the best of rivers. Still, the head could not be left a bare globe of bone, on account of the extremes of heat and cold, nor be allowed to become dull and senseless by an overgrowth of flesh. Wherefore it was covered by a peel or skin which met and grew by the help of the cerebral humor. The diversity of the sutures was caused by the struggle of the food against the courses of the soul. The skin of the head was pierced by fire, and out of the punctures came forth a moisture, part liquid and part of a skinny nature, which was hardened by the pressure of the external cold and became hair. And God gave hair to the head of man to be a light covering, so that it might not interfere with his perceptions. Nails were formed by combining sinew, skin, and bone, and were made by the creators with a view to the future, when, as they knew, women and other animals who would require them would be framed out of men. The gods also mingled natures akin to that of man with other forms and perceptions. Thus trees and plants were created, which were originally wild and have been adapted by cultivation to our use. They partake of that third kind of life which is seated between the midriff and the navel, and is altogether passive and incapable of reflection. When the creators had furnished all these natures for our sustenance, they cut channels through our bodies as in a garden, watering them with a perennial stream. 2 were cut down the back, along the backbone, where the skin and flesh meet, one on the right and the other on the left, having the marrow of generation between them. In the next place, they divided the veins about the head and interlaced them with each other, in order that they might form an additional link between the head and the body, and that the sensations from both sides might be diffused throughout the body. In the third place, they contrived the passage of liquids, which may be explained in this way. Finer bodies retain coarser, but not the coarser the finer, and the belly is capable of retaining food, but not fire and air. God therefore formed a network of fire and air to irrigate the veins, having within it 2 lesser nets, and stretched cords reaching from both the lesser nets to the extremity of the outer net. The inner parts of the net were made by him of fire, the lesser nets and their cavities of air. The 2 latter he made to pass into the mouth, the one ascending by the air pipes from the lungs, the other by the side of the air pipes from the belly. The entrance to the first he divided into 2 parts, both of which he made to meet at the channels of the nose, that when the mouth was closed, the passage connected with it might still be fed with air. The cavity of the network he spread around the hollows of the body, making the entire receptacle to flow into and out of the lesser nets, and the lesser nets into and out of it, while the outer net found a way into and out of the pores of the body, and the internal heat followed the air to and fro. These, as we affirm, are the phenomena of respiration, and all this process takes place in order that the body may be watered and cooled and nourished, and the meat and drink digested and liquefied and carried into the veins. The causes of respiration have now to be considered. The exhalation of the breath through the mouth and nostrils displaces the external air, and at the same time leaves a vacuum into which, through the pores, the air which is displaced enters. Also, the vacuum which is made when the air is exhaled through the pores is filled up by the inhalation of breath through the mouth and nostrils. The explanation of this double phenomenon is as follows. Elements move towards their natural places. Now, as every animal has within him a fountain of fire, the air which is inhaled through the mouth and nostrils, on coming into contact with this, is heated, and when heated, in accordance with the law of attraction, it escapes by the way it entered toward the place of fire. On leaving the body, it is cooled, and drives round the air which it displaces through the pores into the empty lungs. This again is in turn heated by the internal fire, and escapes, as it entered, through the pores. The phenomena of medical cupping glasses, of swallowing, and of the hurling of bodies are to be explained on a similar principle, as also sounds, which are sometimes discordant on account of the inequality of them, and again harmonious by reason of equality. The slower sounds, reaching the swifter, when they begin to pause, by degrees assimilate with them, whence arises a pleasure which even the unwise feel, and which to the wise becomes a higher sense of delight, being an imitation of divine harmony in mortal motions. Streams flow, lightnings play, amber and the magnet attract, not by reason of attraction, but because nature abhors a vacuum, and because things, when compounded or dissolved, move different ways, each to its own place. I will now return to the phenomena of respiration. The fire, entering the belly, minces the food, and as it escapes, fills the veins by drawing after it the divided portions, and thus the streams of nutriment are diffused through the body. The fruits or herbs which are our daily sustenance take all sorts of colors when intermixed, but the color of red or fire predominates, and hence the liquid which we call blood is red, being the nurturing principle of the body, whence all parts are watered and empty places filled. The process of repletion and depletion is produced by the attraction of like to like after the manner of the universal motion. The external elements, by their attraction, are always diminishing the substance of the body. The particles of blood, too, formed out of the newly digested food, are attracted towards kindred elements within the body, and so fill up the void. When more is taken away than flows in, then we decay, and when less, we grow and increase. The young of every animal has the triangles new and closely locked together, and yet the entire frame is soft and delicate, being newly made of marrow and nurtured on milk. These triangles are sharper than those which enter the body from without in the shape of food, and therefore they cut them up. But as life advances, the triangles wear out, and are no longer able to assimilate food, and at length, when the bonds which unite the triangles of the marrow become undone, then in turn unloose the bonds of the soul, and if the release be according to nature, she then flies away with joy. For the death which is natural is pleasant, but that which is caused by violence is painful. Every one may understand the origin of diseases. They may be occasioned by the disarrangement or disproportion of the elements out of which the body is framed. This is the origin of many of them, but the worst of all owe their severity to the following causes. There is a natural order in the human frame, according to which the flesh and sinews are made of blood, the sinews out of the fibers, and the flesh out of the congealed substance which is formed by separation from the fibers. The gluttonous matter which comes away from the sinews and the flesh not only binds the flesh to the bones, but nourishes the bones and waters the marrow. When these processes take place in regular order, the body is in health. But when the flesh wastes and returns into the veins, there is discolored blood, as well as air in the veins, having acid and salt qualities, from which is generated every sort of phlegm and bile. All things go the wrong way, and cease to give nourishment to the body, no longer preserving their natural courses, but at war with themselves, and destructive to the constitution of the body. The oldest part of the flesh, which is hard to decompose, blackens from long burning, and from being corroded grows bitter, and as the bitter element refines away, becomes acid. When tinged with blood, the bitter substance has a red color, and this, when mixed with black, takes the hue of grass. Or again, the bitter substance has an auburn color, when new flesh is decomposed by the internal flame. To all which phenomena, some physician or philosopher who was able to see the one in many has given the name of bile. The various kinds of bile have names answering to their callers. Lymph or serum is of two kinds. First, the way of blood, which is gentle. Secondly, the secretion of dark and bitter bile, which, when mingled under the influence of heat with salt, is malignant and is called acid phlegm. There is also white phlegm, formed by the decomposition of young and tender flesh, and covered with little bubbles, separately invisible, but becoming visible when collected. The water of tears and perspiration and similar substances is also the watery part of fresh phlegm. All these humors become sources of disease when the blood is replenished in irregular ways, and not by food or drink. The danger, however, is not so great when the foundation remains, for then there is a possibility of recovery. But when the substance which unites the flesh and bones is diseased, and is no longer renewed from the muscles and sinews, and instead of being oily and smooth and glutinous, becomes rough and salt and dry, then the fleshy parts fall away and leave the sinews bare and full of brine, and the flesh gets back again into the circulation of the blood and makes the previously mentioned disorders still greater. There are other and worse diseases which are prior to these, as when the bone, through the density of the flesh, does not receive sufficient air and becomes stagnant and gangrened, and crumbling away passes into the food, and the food into the flesh, and the flesh returns again into the blood. Worst of all and most fatal is the disease of the marrow, by which the whole course of the body is reversed. There is a third class of diseases, which are produced, some by wind, and some by phlegm, and some by bile. When the lung, which is the steward of the air, is obstructed by rheums, and in one part no air, and in another too much enters in, then the parts which are unrefreshed by air corrode, and other parts are distorted by the excess of air, and in this manner painful diseases are produced. The most painful are caused by wind generated within the body, which gets about the great sinews of the shoulders. These are termed tetanus. The cure of them is difficult, and in most cases they are relieved only by fever. White phlegm, which is dangerous if kept in by reason of the air bubbles, is not equally dangerous if able to escape through the pores, although it variegates the body, generating divers kinds of epilepsy or the sacred disease. Acid and salt phlegm is the source of catarrh. Inflammations originate in bile, which is sometimes relieved by boils and swellings, but when detained, and above all when mingled with pure blood, generates many inflammatory disorders, disturbing the position of the fibers which are scattered about in the blood in order to maintain the balance of rare and dense, which is necessary to its regular circulation. If the bile, which is only stale blood or liquefied flesh, comes in little by little, it is congealed by the fibers and produces internal cold and shuddering. When it enters with more of a flood, it overcomes the fibers by its heat and reaches the spinal marrow, and burning up the cables of the soul, sets her free from the body. When, on the other hand, the body, though wasted, still holds out, then the bile is expelled, like an exile from a factious state, causing associating diarrheas and dysenteries and similar disorders. The body which is diseased from the effects of fire is in a continual fever. When air is the agent, the fever is quotidian. When water, the fever intermits a day. When earth, which is the most sluggish element, the fever intermits 3 days, and is with difficulty shaken off. Of mental disorders there are 2 sorts, one madness, the other ignorance, and they may be justly attributed to disease. Excessive pleasures or pains are among the greatest diseases, and deprive men of their senses. When the seed about the spinal marrow is too abundant, the body has too great pleasures and pains, and during a great part of his life he who is the subject of them is more or less mad. he is often thought bad, but this is a mistake, for the truth is that the intemperance of lust is due to the fluidity of the marrow produced by the loose consistency of the bones. And this is true of vice in general, which is commonly regarded as disgraceful, whereas it is really involuntary and arises from a bad habit of the body and evil education. In like manner, the soul is often made vicious by the influence of bodily pain. The briny phlegm and other bitter and bilious humors wander over the body and find no exit, but are compressed within, and mingle their own vapors with the motions of the soul, and are carried to the 3 places of the soul, creating infinite varieties of trouble and melancholy, of rashness and cowardice, of forgetfulness and stupidity. When men are in this evil plight of body, and evil forms of government and evil discourses are superadded, and there is no education to save them, they are corrupted through 2 causes, but of neither of them are they really the authors. For the planters are to blame rather than the plants, the educators and not the educated. Still, we should endeavor to attain virtue and avoid vice, but this is part of another subject. Enough of disease. I have now to speak of the means by which the mind and body are to be preserved, a higher theme than the other. The good is the beautiful, and the beautiful is the symmetrical, and there is no greater or fairer symmetry than that of body and soul, as the contrary is the greatest of deformities. A leg or an arm too long or too short is at once ugly and unserviceable, and the same is true if body and soul are disproportionate. For a strong and impassioned soul may fret the pygmy body to decay, and so produce convulsions and other evils. The violence of controversy or the earnestness of enquiry will often generate inflammations and rheums which are not understood or assigned to their true cause by the professors of medicine. And in like manner, the body may be too much for the soul, darkening the reason and quickening the animal desires. The only security is to preserve the balance of the 2, and to this end the mathematician or philosopher must practice gymnastics, and the gymnast must cultivate music. The parts of the body, too, must be treated in the same way. They should receive their appropriate exercise. For the body is set in motion when it is heated and cooled by the elements which enter in, or is dried up and moistened by external things, and if given up to these processes when at rest, it is liable to destruction. But the natural motion, as in the world, so also in the human frame, produces harmony and divides hostile powers. The best exercise is the spontaneous motion of the body, as in gymnastics, because most akin to the motion of mind. Not so good is the motion of which the source is in another, as in sailing or riding. Least good when the body is at rest and the motion is in parts only, which is a species of motion imparted by physic. This should only be resorted to by men of sense in extreme cases. Lesser diseases are not to be irritated by medicine. For every disease is akin to the living being and has an appointed term, just as life has, which depends on the form of the triangles, and cannot be protracted when they are worn out. And he who, instead of accepting his destiny, endeavors to prolong his life by medicine, is likely to multiply and magnify his diseases. Regimen and not medicine is the true cure when a man has time at his disposal. Enough of the nature of man and of the body, and of training and education. The subject is a great one, and cannot be adequately treated as an appendage to another. To sum up all in a word, there are 3 kinds of soul located within us, and any one of them, if remaining inactive, becomes very weak, if exercised, very strong. Wherefore, we should duly train and exercise all 3 kinds. The divine soul God lodged in the head, to raise us, plants which are not of earthly origin to our kindred, for the head is nearest to heaven. He who is intent upon the gratification of his desires and cherishes the mortal soul has all his ideas mortal, and is himself mortal in the truest sense. But he who seeks after knowledge and exercises the divine part of himself in godly and immortal thoughts attains to truth and immortality as far as is possible to men, and also to happiness, while he is training up within him the divine principle and indwelling power of order. There is only one way in which one person can benefit another, and that is by assigning to him his proper nurture and motion. To the motions of the soul answer the motions of the universe, and by the study of these the individual is restored to his original nature. Thus we have finished the discussion of the universe, which, according to our original intention, has now been brought down to the creation of man. Completeness seems to require that something should be briefly said about other animals, first of women, who are probably degenerate and cowardly men. And when they degenerated, the gods implanted in men the desire of union with them, creating in man one animate substance, and in woman another, in the following manner. The outlet for liquids they connected with the living principle of the spinal marrow, which the man has a desire to emit into the fruitful womb of the woman. This is like a fertile field in which the seed is quickened and matured, and at last brought to light. When this desire is unsatisfied, the man is overmastered by the power of the generative organs, and the woman is subjected to disorders from the obstruction of the passages of the breath, until the two meet and pluck the fruit of the tree. The race of birds was created out of innocent, light-minded men, who thought to pursue the study of the heavens by sight. These were transformed into birds, and grew feathers instead of hair. The race of wild animals were men who had no philosophy, and never looked up to heaven or used the courses of the head, but followed only the influences of passion. Naturally, they turned to their kindred earth, and put their forelegs to the ground, and their heads were crushed into strange oblong forms. Some of them have 4 feet, and some of them more than 4. The latter, who are the more senseless, drawing closer to their native element. The most senseless of all have no limbs, and trail their whole body on the ground. The 4th kind are the inhabitants of the waters. These are made out of the most senseless and ignorant and impure of men, whom God placed in the uttermost parts of the world, in return for their utter ignorance, and caused them to respire water instead of the pure element of air. Such are the laws by which animals pass into one another. And so the world received animals, mortal and immortal, and was fulfilled with them, and became a visible God, comprehending the visible, made in the image of the intellectual, being the one perfect, only begotten heaven. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the Introduction to Timaeus. Recorded by David Huston. Timaeus by Plato. Translated by Benjamin Jowett. Introduction and Analysis, Section 2. Nature, in the aspect which she presented to a Greek philosopher of the 4th century before Christ, is not easily reproduced to modern eyes. The associations of mythology and poetry have to be added, and the unconscious influence of science has to be subtracted, before we can behold the heavens or the earth as they appeared to the Greek. The philosopher himself was a child, and also a man, a child in the range of his attainments, but also a great intelligence having an insight into nature, and often anticipations of the truth. He was full of original thoughts, and yet liable to be imposed upon by the most obvious fallacies. He occasionally confused numbers with ideas, and atoms with numbers. His a priori notions were all out of proportion to his experience. He was ready to explain the phenomena of the heavens by the most trivial analogies of earth. The experiments which nature worked for him he sometimes accepted, but he never tried experiments for himself which would either prove or disprove his theories. His knowledge was unequal. While in some branches, such as medicine and astronomy, he had made considerable proficiency, there were others, such as chemistry, electricity, mechanics, of which the very names were unknown to him. He was a natural enemy of mythology, and yet mythological ideas still retained their hold over him. He was endeavoring to form a conception of principles, but these principles or ideas were regarded by him as real powers or entities, to which the world had been subjected. He was always tending to argue from what was near to what was remote, from what was known to what was unknown, from man to the universe, and back again from the universe to man. While he was arranging the world, he was arranging the forms of thought in his own mind, and the light from within and the light from without often crossed and helped to confuse one another. He might be compared to a builder engaged in some great design, who could only dig with his hands because he was unprovided with common tools, or to some poet or musician, like Timaeus, Ion 534d, obliged to accommodate his lyric raptures to the limits of the tetrachord or of the flute. The Hesiodic and Orphic cosmogonies were a phase of thought intermediate between mythology and philosophy, and had a great influence on the beginnings of knowledge. There was nothing behind them. They were to physical science what the poems of Homer were to early Greek history. They made men think of the world as a whole. They carried the mind back into the infinity of past time. They suggested the first observation of the effects of fire and water on the earth's surface. To the ancient physics they stood much in the same relation which geology does to modern science. But the Greek was not, like the inquirer of the last generation, confined to a period of 6,000 years. He was able to speculate freely on the effects of infinite ages in the production of physical phenomena. He could imagine cities which had existed time out of mind. Statesman 302a, Laws 3,676. Laws are forms of art and music which had lasted, not in word only, but in very truth for 10,000 years. Laws 2,656e. Compare also 7,799a. He was aware that natural phenomena like the delta of the Nile might have slowly accumulated in long periods of time. Compare Herodotus 2,510. But he seems to suppose that the course of events was recurring rather than progressive. To this he was probably led by the fixedness of Egyptian customs, and the general observation that there were other civilizations in the world more ancient than that of Hellas. The ancient philosophers found in mythology many ideas which, if not originally derived from nature, were easily transferred to her, such, for example, as love or hate, corresponding to attraction or repulsion, or the conception of necessity allied both to the regularity and irregularity of nature, or of the chance, the nameless or unknown cause, or of justice, symbolizing the law of compensation, are of the fates and furies, typifying the fixed order or the extraordinary convulsions of nature. Their own interpretations of Homer and the poets were supposed by them to be the original meaning. Musing in themselves on the phenomena of nature, they were relieved at being able to utter the thoughts of their hearts in figures of speech, which to them were not figures, and were already consecrated by tradition. Hesiod and the Orphic poets moved in a region of half-personification, in which the meaning or principle appeared through the person. In their vaster conceptions of chaos, Erebus, ether, night, and the like, the first rude attempts at generalization are dimly seen. The gods themselves, especially the greater gods, such as Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, Athene, are universals as well as individuals. They were gradually becoming lost in a common conception of mind or God. They continue to exist for the purposes of ritual or of art, but for the 6th century onwards, or even earlier, there arose and gained strength in the minds of men the notion of one God, greatest among gods and men, who is all sight, all hearing, all knowing. Xenophanes. Under the influence of such ideas, perhaps also deriving from the traditions of their own or of other nations' scraps of medicine and astronomy, men came to the observation of nature. The Greek philosopher looked at the blue circle of the heavens, and it flashed upon him that all things were one. The tumult of sense abated, and the mind found repose in the thought which former generations have been striving to realize. The first expression of this was some element, rarefied by degrees into a pure abstraction, and purged from any tincture of sense. Soon an inner world of ideas began to be unfolded, more absorbing, more overpowering, more abiding than the brightest of visible objects, which to the eye of the philosopher looking inward seemed to pale before them, retaining only a faint and precarious existence. At the same time, the minds of men parted in the two great divisions of those who saw only a principle of motion, and of those who saw only a principle of rest, in nature and in themselves. They were born Heracliteans or Eleatics, as there have been in later generations born Aristotelians or Platonists. Like some philosophers in modern times, who are accused of making a theory first and finding their facts afterwards, the advocates of either opinion never thought of applying either to themselves or to their adversaries the criterion of fact. They were mastered by their ideas and not masters of them. Like the Heraclitean fanatics whom Plato had ridiculed in the Theaetetus, 179e, 180, they were incapable of giving a reason of the faith that was in them, and had all the animosities of a religious sect. Yet doubtless there was some first impression derived from external nature, which, as in mythology, so also in philosophy, worked upon the minds of the first thinkers. Though incapable of induction or generalization in the modern sense, they caught an inspiration from the external world. The most general facts or appearances of nature, the circle of the universe, the nutritive power of water, the air which is the breath of life, the destructive force of fire, the seeming regularity of the greater part of nature and the irregularity of a remnant, the recurrence of day and night and of the seasons, the solid earth, and the impalpable ether were always present to them. The great source of error, and also the beginning of truth to them, was reasoning from analogy. They could see resemblances, but not differences, and they were incapable of distinguishing illustration from argument. Analogy in modern times only points the way, and is immediately verified by experiment. The dreams and visions which pass through the philosopher's mind, of resemblances between different classes of substances, or between the animal and vegetable world, are put into the refiner's fire, and the dross and other elements which adhere to them are purged away. But the contemporary of Plato and Socrates was incapable of resisting the power of any analogy which occurred to him, and was drawn into any consequences which seemed to follow. He had no methods of difference, or of concomitant variations, by the use of which he could distinguish the accidental from the essential. He could not isolate phenomena, and he was helpless against the influence of any word which had an equivocal or double sense. Yet without this crude use of analogy, the ancient physical philosopher would have stood still. He could not have made even one guess among many without comparison. The course of natural phenomena would have passed unheeded before his eyes, like fair sights or musical sounds before the eyes and ears of an animal. Even the fetishism of the savage is the beginning of reasoning. The assumption of the most fanciful of causes indicates a higher mental state than the absence of all inquiry about them. The tendency to argue from the higher to the lower, from man to the world, has led to many errors, but has also had an elevating influence on philosophy. The conception of the world as a whole, a person, an animal, has been the source of hasty generalizations, yet this general grasp of nature led also to a spirit of comprehensiveness in early philosophy, which has not increased but rather diminished as the fields of knowledge have become more divided. The modern physicist confines himself to one or perhaps two branches of science, but he comparatively seldom rises above his own department, and often falls under the narrowing influence which any single branch, when pursued to the exclusion of every other, has over the mind. Language, too, exercised a spell over the beginnings of physical philosophy, leading to error and sometimes to truth, for many thoughts were suggested by the double meanings of words. Compare stoicheion, syllabae, musicae, harmonia, cosmos, and the accidental distinctions of words sometimes led the ancient philosopher to make corresponding differences in things. Compare philesthai, eputhemein, phobos, deos, eidos, eistron. If they are the same, why have they different names? Or if they are different, why have they the same name? is an argument not easily answered in the infancy of knowledge. The modern philosopher has always been taught the lesson which he still imperfectly learns, that he must disengage himself from the influence of words. Nor are there wanting in Plato, who was himself too often the victim of them, impressive admonitions that we should regard not words but things. Compare Statesman 261e. But upon the whole, the ancients, though not entirely dominated by them, were much more subject to the influence of words than the moderns. They had no clear divisions of colors or substances. Even the four elements were undefined. The fields of knowledge were not parted off. They were bringing order out of disorder, having a small grain of experience mingled in a confused heap of a priori notions. And yet probably their first impressions, the illusions and mirages of their fancy, created a greater intellectual activity and made a nearer approach to the truth than any patient investigation of isolated facts, for which the time had not yet come, could have accomplished. There was one more illusion to which the ancient philosophers were subject, and against which Plato in his later dialogues seems to be struggling, the tendency to mere abstractions. Not perceiving that pure abstraction is only negation, they thought that the greater the abstraction, the greater the truth. Behind any pair of ideas, a new idea which comprehended them, the tritos anthropos, as it was technically termed, began at once to appear. Two are truer than three, one than two. The words being, or unity, or essence, or good, become sacred to them. They did not see that they had a word only, and in one sense the most unmeaning of words. They did not understand that the content of notions is in inverse proportion to their universality. The element which is the most widely diffused is also the thinnest, or, in the language of the common logic, the greater the extension, the less the comprehension. But this vacant idea of a whole without parts, of a subject without predicates, a rest without motion, has also been the most fruitful of all ideas. It is the beginning of a priori thought, and indeed of thinking at all. Men were led to conceive it, not by a love of hasty generalization, but by a divine instinct, a dialectical enthusiasm, in which the human faculties seem to yearn for enlargement. We know that being is only the verb of existence, the copula, the most general symbol of relation, the first and most meagre of abstractions. But to some of the ancient philosophers this little word appeared to attain divine proportions, and to comprehend all truth. Being or essence, and similar words, represented to them a supreme or divine being, in which they thought that they found the containing and continuing principle of the universe. In a few years the human mind was peopled with abstractions. A new world was called into existence to give law and order to the old, but between them there was still a gulf, and no one could pass from the one to the other. Number and figure were the greatest instruments of thought which were possessed by the Greek philosopher. Having the same power over the mind which was exerted by abstract ideas, they were also capable of practical application. Many curious, and to the earlier thinker mysterious properties of them came to light when they were compared with one another. They admitted of infinite multiplication and construction. In Pythagorean triangles, or in proportions of 1, 2, 4, 8, and 1, 3, 9, 27, or compounds of them, the laws of the world seemed to be more than half revealed. They were also capable of infinite subdivision, a wonder and also a puzzle to the ancient thinker. Compare Republic 7, 525e. They were not, like being or essence, mere vacant abstractions, but admitted of progress and growth, while at the same time they confirmed a higher sentiment of the mind, that there was order in the universe. And so there began to be a real sympathy between the world within and the world without. The numbers and figures which were present to the mind's eye became invisible to the eye of sense. The truth of nature was mathematics. The other properties of objects seemed to reappear only in the light of number. Law and morality also found a natural expression in number and figure. Instruments of such power and elasticity could not fail to be a most gracious assistance to the first efforts of human intelligence. There was another reason why numbers had so great an influence over the minds of early thinkers. They were verified by experience. Every use of them, even the most trivial, assured men of their truth. They were everywhere to be found, in the least things and the greatest alike. 1, 2, 3, counted on the fingers, was a trivial matter. Republic 7, 522c. A little instrument out of which to create a world, but from these and by the help of these all our knowledge of nature has been developed. They were the measure of all things, and seemed to give law to all things. Nature was rescued from chaos and confusion by their power. The notes of music, the motions of the stars, the forms of atoms, the evolution and recurrence of days, months, years, the military divisions of an army, the civil divisions of a state, seem to afford a present witness of them, what would have become of man, or of the world if deprived of number. Republic 7, 522e. The mystery of number and the mystery of music were akin. There was a music of rhythm and of harmonious motion everywhere, and to the real connection which existed between music and number, a fanciful or imaginary relation was superadded. There was a music of the spheres as well as of the notes of the lyre. If in all things seen there was number and figure, why should they not also pervade the unseen world, with which, by their wonderful and unchangeable nature, they seem to hold communion? Two other points strike us in the use which the ancient philosophers made of numbers. First, they applied to external nature the relations of them which they found in their own minds, and where nature seemed to be at variance with number, as for example in the case of fractions, they protested against her. Republic 7, 525, Aristotle, Metaphysics 1, 6. Having long meditated on the properties of 1, 2, 4, 8, or 1, 3, 9, 27, or of 3, 4, 5, they discovered in them many curious correspondences, and were disposed to find in them the secret of the universe. Secondly, they applied number and figure equally to those parts of physics, such as astronomy or mechanics, in which the modern philosopher expects to find them, and to those in which he would never think of looking for them, such as physiology and psychology. For these sciences were not yet divided, and there was nothing really irrational in arguing that the same laws which regulated the heavenly bodies were partially applied to the erring limbs or brain of man. Astrology was the form which the lively fancy of ancient thinkers almost necessarily gave to astronomy. The observation that the lower principle, that is, mechanics, is always seen in the higher, that is, in the phenomena of life, further tended to perplex them. Plato's doctrine of the same and the other ruling the courses of the heavens and of the human body is not a mere vagary, but is a natural result of the state of knowledge and thought at which he had arrived. When in modern times we contemplate the heavens, a certain amount of scientific truth imperceptibly blends, even with the cursory glance of an unscientific person. He knows that the earth is revolving around the sun, and not the sun around the earth. He does not imagine the earth to be the center of the universe, and he has some conception of chemistry and the cognate sciences. A very different aspect of nature would have been present to the mind of the early Greek philosopher. He would have beheld the earth as a surface only, not mirrored, however faintly, in the glass of science, but indissolubly connected with some theory of one, two, or more elements. He would have seen the world pervaded by number and figure, animated by a principle of motion, immanent in a principle of rest. He would have tried to construct the universe on a quantitative principle, seeming to find in endless combinations of geometric figures or in the infinite variety of their sizes a sufficient account of the multiplicity of phenomena. To these a priori speculations he would add a rude conception of matter and his own immediate experiences of health and disease. His cosmos would necessarily be imperfect and unequal, being the first attempt to impress form and order on the primeval chaos of human knowledge. He would see all things as in a dream. The ancient physical philosophers have been charged by Dr. Whewell and others with wasting their fine intelligences in wrong methods of enquiry, and their progress in moral and political philosophy has been sometimes contrasted with their supposed failure in physical investigations. They had plenty of ideas, says Dr. Whewell, and perhaps plenty of facts, but their ideas did not accurately represent the facts with which they were acquainted. This is a very crude and misleading way of describing ancient science. It is the mistake of an uneducated person, uneducated, that is, in the higher sense of the word, who imagines everyone else has to be like himself and explains every other age by his own. No doubt the ancients often fell into strange and fanciful errors. The time had not yet arrived for the slower and surer path of the modern inductive philosophy. But it remains to be shown that they could have done more in their age and country, or that the contributions which they made to the sciences with which they were acquainted are not as great upon the whole as those made by their successors. There is no single step in astronomy as great as that of the nameless Pythagorean, who first conceived the world to be a body moving around the sun in space. There is no truer or more comprehensive principle than the application of mathematics alike to the heavenly bodies and to the particles of matter. The ancients had not the instruments which would have enabled them to correct or verify their anticipations, and their opportunities of observation were limited. Plato probably did more for physical science by asserting the supremacy of mathematics than Aristotle or his disciples by their collections of facts. When the thinkers of modern times, following Bacon, undervalue or disparage the speculations of ancient philosophers, they seem wholly to forget the conditions of the world and of the human mind, under which they carried on their investigations. When we accuse them of being under the influence of words, do we suppose that we are altogether free from this illusion? When we remark that Greek physics soon became stationary or extinct, may we not observe also that there have been, and may be again, periods in the history of modern philosophy which have been barren and unproductive? We might as well maintain that Greek art was not real or great, because it had nihil simileat secundum, as they say that Greek physics were a failure because they admire no subsequent progress. The charge of premature generalization which is often urged against ancient philosophers is really an anachronism, for they can hardly be said to have generalized at all. They may be said more truly to have cleared up and defined by the help of experience ideas which they already possessed. The beginnings of thought about nature must always have this character. A true method is the result of many ages of experiment and observation, and is ever going on and enlarging with the progress of science and knowledge. At first men personify nature, then they form impressions of nature. At last they conceive measure or laws of nature. They pass out of mythology and into philosophy. Early science is not a process of discovery in the modern sense, but rather a process of correcting by observation, and to a certain extent only, the first impressions of nature which mankind, when they began to think, had received from poetry or language or unintelligent sense. Of all scientific truths, the greatest and simplest is the uniformity of nature. This was expressed by the ancients in many ways, as fate, or necessity, or measure, or limit. Unexpected events, of which the cause was unknown to them, they attributed to chance. Compare Thucydides 1:140. But their conception of nature was never that of law interrupted by exceptions, a somewhat unfortunate metaphysical invention of modern times, which is at variance with facts and has failed to satisfy the requirements of thought. End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Introduction to Timaeus. Recording by Philippa. Timaeus by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. Introduction and Analysis. Section 3. Plato's account of the soul is partly mythical or figurative, and partly literal. Not that either he or we can draw a line between them, or say, this is poetry, this is philosophy, for the transition from the one to the other is imperceptible. Neither must we expect to find in him absolute consistency. He is apt to pass from one level or stage of thought to another, without always making it apparent that he is changing his ground. In such passages we have to interpret his meaning by the general spirit of his writings. To reconcile his inconsistencies would be contrary to the first principles of criticism, and fatal to any true understanding of him. There is a further difficulty in explaining this part of the Timaeus. The natural order of thought is inverted. We begin with the most abstract, and proceed from the abstract to the concrete. We are searching into things which are upon the utmost limit of human intelligence, and then, of a sudden, we fall rather heavily to the earth. There are no intermediate steps which lead from one to the other. But the abstract is a vacant form to us until brought into relation with man and nature. God and the world are mere names, like the being of the Eleatics, unless some human qualities are added to them. Yet the negation has a kind of unknown meaning to us. The priority of God and of the world, which he is imagined to have created, to all other existences, gives a solemn awe to them. And as in other systems of theology and philosophy, that of which we know least has the greatest interest to us. There is no use in attempting to define or explain the first God in the Platonic system, who has sometimes been thought to answer to God the Father, or the world, in whom the fathers of the Church seemed to recognize the firstborn of every creature. Nor need we discuss at length how far Plato agrees in the later Jewish idea of creation, according to which God made the world out of nothing. For his original conception of matter as something which has no qualities is really a negation. Moreover, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the creation of the world is described, even more explicitly than in the Timaeus, not as a single act, but as a work or process which occupied 6 days. There is a chaos in both, and it would be untrue to say that the Greek, any more than the Hebrew, had any definite belief in the eternal existence of matter. The beginning of things vanished into the distance. The real creation began not with matter, but with ideas. According to Plato in the Timaeus, God took of the same and the other, of the divided and undivided, of the finite and infinite, and made essence, and out of the three combined created the soul of the world. To the soul he added a body, formed out of the 4 elements. The general meaning of these words is that God imparted determinations of thought, or, as we might say, gave law and variety to the material universe. The elements are moving in a disorderly manner before the work of creation begins, 30a, and there is an eternal pattern of the world which, like the idea of good, is not the Creator himself, but not separable from him. The pattern, too, though eternal, is a creation, a world of thought prior to the world of sense, which may be compared to the wisdom of God in the book of Ecclesiasticus, or to the God in the form of a globe of the old Eleatic philosophers. The visible, which already exists, is fashioned in the likeness of this eternal pattern. On the other hand, there is no truth of which Plato is more firmly convinced than of the priority of the soul to the body, both in the universe and in man. So inconsistent are the forms in which he describes the works which no tongue can utter, his language, as he himself says, 29c, partaking of his own uncertainty about the things of which he is speaking. We may remark in passing that the Platonic, compared with the Jewish description of the process of creation, has less of freedom or spontaneity. The Creator in Plato is still subject to a remnant of necessity which he cannot wholly overcome, compare 35a. When his work is accomplished, he remains in his own nature. Plato is more sensible than the Hebrew prophet of the existence of evil, which he seeks to put as far as possible out of the way of God, compare 42d. And he can only suppose this to be accomplished by God retiring into himself, and committing the lesser works of creation to inferior powers. Compare, however, Laws 10:903 for another solution of the difficulty. Nor can we attach any intelligible meaning to his words when he speaks of the visible being in the image of the invisible, 28. For how can that which is divided be like that which is undivided? Or that which is changing be the copy of that which is unchanging? All the old difficulties about the ideas come back upon us in an altered form. We can imagine 2 worlds, one of which is the mere double of the other, or one of which is an imperfect copy of the other, or one of which is the vanishing ideal of the other. But we cannot imagine an intellectual world which has no qualities, a thing in itself, a point which has no parts or magnitude, which is nowhere and nothing. This cannot be the archetype according to which God made the world, and is in reality, whether in Plato or in Kant, a mere negative residuum of human thought. There is another aspect of the same difficulty which appears to have no satisfactory solution. In what relation does the archetype stand to the Creator himself? For the idea or pattern of the world is not the thought of God, but a separate, self-existent nature of which creation is the copy. We can only reply, 1. That to the mind of Plato subject and object were not yet distinguished, 2. That he supposes the process of creation to take place in accordance with his own theory of ideas, and as we cannot give a consistent account of the one, neither can we of the other. He means 3, to say that the creation of the world is not a material process of working with legs and arms, but ideal and intellectual, according to his own fine expression, the thought of God made the God that was to be, 34a. He means 4, to draw an absolute distinction between the invisible or unchangeable, which is or is the place of mind or being, and the world of sense or becoming, which is visible and changing. He means 5, that the idea of the world is prior to the world, just as the other ideas are prior to sensible objects, and like them may be regarded as eternal and self-existent, and also, like the idea of good, may be viewed apart from the divine mind. There are several other questions which we might ask, and which can receive no answer, or at least only an answer of the same kind as the preceding. How can matter be conceived to exist without form? Or how can the essences or forms of things be distinguished from the eternal ideas, or essence itself from the soul? Or how could there have been motion in the chaos, when as yet time was not? Or how did chaos come into existence, if not by the will of the Creator? Or how could there have been a time when the world was not, if time was not? Or how could the Creator have taken portions of an indivisible same? Or how could space or anything else have been eternal when time is only created? Or how could the surfaces of geometrical figures have formed solids? We must reply again that we cannot follow Plato in all his inconsistencies, but that the gaps of thought are probably more apparent to us than to him. He would perhaps have said that the first things are known only to God, and to him of men whom God loves. How often have the gaps in theology been concealed from the eye of faith? And we may say that only by an effort of metaphysical imagination can we hope to understand Plato from his own point of view. We must not ask for consistency. Everywhere we find traces of the Platonic theory of knowledge expressed in an objective form, which by us has to be translated into the subjective before we can attach any meaning to it. And this theory is exhibited in so many different points of view that we cannot with any certainty interpret one dialogue by another, for example the Timaeus by the Parmenides, or Phaedrus or Philebus. The soul of the world may also be conceived as the personification of the numbers and figures in which the heavenly bodies move. Imagine these as in a Pythagorean dream, stripped of qualitative difference and reduced to mathematical abstractions. They too conform to the principle of the same, and may be compared with the modern conception of laws of nature. They are in space, but not in time, and they are the makers of time. They are represented as constantly thinking of the same, for thought, in the view of Plato, is equivalent to truth or law, and need not imply a human consciousness, a conception which is familiar enough to us, but has no place, hardly even a name, in ancient Greek philosophy. To this principle of the same is opposed the principle of the other, the principle of irregularity and disorder, of necessity and chance, which is only partially impressed by mathematical laws and figures. We may observe, by the way, that the principle of the other, which is the principle of plurality and variation in the Timaeus, has nothing in common with the other of the sophist, which is the principle of determination. The element of the same dominates to a certain extent over the other. The fixed stars keep the wanderers of the inner circle in their courses, 36c, and a similar principle of fixedness or order appears to regulate the bodily constitution of man, 89a, 90d, but there still remains a rebellious seed of evil derived from the original chaos, which is the source of disorder in the world and of vice and disease in man. But what did Plato mean by essence, ousia, which is the intermediate nature compounded of the same and the other, and out of which, together with these two, the soul of the world is created? It is difficult to explain a process of thought so strange and unaccustomed to us, in which modern distinctions run into one another and are lost sight of. First let us consider once more the meaning of the same and the other. The same is the unchanging and indivisible, the heaven of the fixed stars partaking of the divine nature, which, having law in itself, gives law to all besides, and is the element of order and permanence in man and on the earth. It is the rational principle, mind regarded as a work, as creation, not as the creator. The old tradition of Parmenides and of the Eleatic being, the foundation of so much in the philosophy of Greece and of the world, was lingering in Plato's mind. The other is the variable or changing element, the residuum of disorder or chaos, which cannot be reduced to order, nor altogether banished, the source of evil, seen in the errors of man and also in the wanderings of the planets, a necessity which protrudes through nature. Of this too there was a shadow in the Eleatic philosophy in the realm of opinion, which, like a mist, seemed to darken the purity of truth in itself. So far the words of Plato may perhaps find an intelligible meaning. But when he goes on to speak of the essence which is compounded out of both, the track becomes fainter, and we can only follow him with hesitating steps. But still we find a trace reappearing of the teaching of Anaxagoras. All was confusion, and then mind came and arranged things. We have already remarked that Plato was not acquainted with the modern distinction of subject and object, and therefore he sometimes confuses mind and the things of mind, nous and noeta. By ousia he clearly means some conception of the intelligible and the intelligent. It belongs to the class of noeta. Matter, being, the same, the eternal, for any of these terms being almost vacant of meaning, is equally suitable to express indefinite existence, are compared or united with the other or diverse, and out of the union or comparison is elicited the idea of intelligence, the one in many, brighter than any Promethean fire, compare Philippa 16c, which coexisting with them, and so forming a new existence, is or becomes the intelligible world. So we may perhaps venture to paraphrase or interpret, or put into other words, the parable in which Plato has wrapped up his conception of the creation of the world. The explanation may help to fill up with figures of speech the void of knowledge. The entire compound was divided by the Creator in certain proportions and reunited. It was then cut into two strips, which were bent into an inner circle and an outer, both moving with an uniform motion around the centre, the outer circle containing the fixed, the inner the wandering stars. The soul of the world was diffused everywhere, from the centre to the circumference. To this God gave a body, consisting at first of fire and earth, and afterwards receiving an addition of air and water, because solid bodies like the world are always connected by two middle terms, and not by one. The world was made in the form of a globe, and all the material elements were exhausted in the work of creation. The proportions in which the soul of the world, as well as the human soul, is divided, answer to a series of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, 8, 27, composed of the two Pythagorean progressions, 1, 2, 4, 8, and 1, 3, 9, 27, of which the number 1 represents a point, 2 and 3 lines, 4 and 8, 9 and 27 the squares and cubes, respectively, of 2 and 3. This series, of which the intervals are afterwards filled up, probably represents 1. The diatonic scale, according to the Pythagoreans and Plato; 2. The order and distances of the heavenly bodies; and 3 may possibly contain an allusion to the music of the spheres, which is referred to in the myth at the end of the Republic. The meaning of the words that solid bodies are always connected by two middle terms, or mean proportionals, has been much disputed. The most received explanation is that of Martin, who supposes that Plato is only speaking of surfaces and solids compounded of prime numbers, i.e. of numbers not made up of two factors, or, in other words, only measurable by unity. The square of any such number represents a surface, the cube a solid. The squares of any two such numbers, e.g. 2 squared, 3 squared, 4, 9, have always a single mean proportional, e.g. 4 and 9, have the single mean 6, whereas the cubes of primes, e.g. 3 cubed and 5 cubed, have always 2 mean proportionals, e.g. 27 to 45 to 75 to 125. But to this explanation of Martin's it may be objected, 1, that Plato nowhere says that his proportion is to be limited to prime numbers, 2, that the limitation of surfaces to squares is also not to be found in his words, nor, 3, is there any evidence to show that the distinction of prime from other numbers was known to him. What Plato chiefly intends to express is that a solid requires a stronger bond than a surface, and that the double bond which is given by 2 means is stronger than the single bond given by 1. Having reflected on the singular numerical phenomena of the existence of one mean proportional between 2 square numbers, or rather perhaps only between the 2 lowest squares, and of 2 mean proportionals between 2 cubes, perhaps again confining his attention to the 2 lowest cubes, he finds in the latter symbol an expression of the relation of the elements, as in the former an image of the combination of 2 surfaces. Between fire and earth, the 2 extremes, he remarks that there are introduced not 1 but 2 elements, air and water, which are compared to the 2 mean proportionals between 2 cube numbers. The vagueness of his language does not allow us to determine whether anything more than this was intended by him. Leaving the further explanation of details, which the reader will find discussed at length in Book and Martin, we may now return to the main argument. Why did God make the world? Like man, he must have a purpose, and his purpose is the diffusion of that goodness or good which he himself is. The term goodness is not to be understood in this passage as meaning benevolence or love in the Christian sense of the term, but rather law, order, harmony, like the idea of good in the Republic. The ancient mythologies and even the Hebrew prophets had spoken of the jealousy of God, and the Greek had imagined that there was a nemesis always attending the prosperity of mortals. But Plato delights to think of God as the author of order in his works, who, like a father, lives over again in his children, and can never have too much of good or friendship among his creatures. Only as there is a certain remnant of evil inherent in matter which he cannot get rid of, he detaches himself from them and leaves them to themselves, that he may be guiltless of their faults and sufferings. Between the ideal and the sensible, Plato imposes the 2 natures of time and space. Time is conceived by him to be only the shadow or image of eternity, which ever is, and never has been or will be, but is described in a figure only as past or future. This is one of the great thoughts of early philosophy which are still as difficult to our minds as they were to the early thinkers, or perhaps more difficult because we more distinctly see the consequences which are involved in such an hypothesis. All the objections which may be urged against Kant's doctrine of the ideality of space and time at once press upon us. If time is unreal, then all which is contained in time is unreal, the succession of human thoughts as well as the flux of sensations. There is no connecting link between phenomena and onta. Yet, on the other hand, we are conscious that knowledge is independent of time, that truth is not a thing of yesterday or tomorrow, but an eternal now. To the spectator of all time and all existence, the universe remains at rest. The truths of geometry and arithmetic in all their combinations are always the same. The generations of men, like the leaves of the forest, come and go, but the mathematical laws by which the world is governed remain, and seem as if they could never change. The ever-present image of space is transferred to time. Succession is conceived as extension. We remark that Plato does away with the above and below in space, as he has done away with the absolute existence of past and future. The course of time, unless regularly marked by divisions of number, partakes of the indefiniteness of the Heraclitean flux. By such reflections we may conceive the Greek to have attained the metaphysical conception of eternity, which to the Hebrew was gained by meditation on the divine being. No one saw that this objective was really a subjective, and involved the subjectivity of all knowledge. Non in tempore, sed cum tempore, finxit Deus mundum, says St. Augustine, repeating a thought derived from the Timaeus, but apparently unconscious of the results to which his doctrine would have led. The contradictions involved in the conception of time or motion, like the infinitesimal in space, were a source of perplexity to the mind of the Greek, who was driven to find a point of view above or beyond them. They had sprung up in the decline of the Eleatic philosophy, and were very familiar to Plato, as we gather from the Parmenides. The consciousness of them had led the great Eleatic philosopher to describe the nature of God or being under negatives. He sings of being unbegotten and imperishable, unmoved and never-ending, which never was nor will be, but always is, one and continuous, which cannot spring from any other, for it cannot be said or imagined not to be. The idea of eternity was for a great part a negation. There are regions of speculation in which the negative is hardly separable from the positive, and even seems to pass into it. Not only Buddhism, but Greek as well as Christian philosophy show that it is quite possible that the human mind should retain an enthusiasm for mere negations. In different ages and countries there have been forms of light in which nothing could be discerned, and which have nevertheless exercised a life-giving and illumining power. For the higher intelligence of man seems to require not only something above sense, but above knowledge, which can only be described as mind or being or truth or God or the unchangeable and eternal element, in the expression of which all predicates fail and fall short. Eternity, or the eternal, is not merely the unlimited in time, but the truest of all being, the most real of all realities, the most certain of all knowledge, which we nevertheless only see through a glass darkly. The passionate earnestness of Parmenides contrasts with the vacuity of the thought which he is revolving in his mind. Space is said by Plato to be the containing vessel or nurse of generation. Reflecting on the simplest kinds of external objects, which to the ancients were the four elements, he was led to a more general notion of a substance, more or less like themselves, out of which they were fashioned. He would not have them too precisely distinguished. Thus seems to have arisen the first dim perception of hyle, or matter, which has played so great a part in the metaphysical philosophy of Aristotle and his followers. But besides the material out of which the elements are made, there is also a space in which they are contained. There arises thus a second nature which the senses are incapable of discerning, and which can hardly be referred to the intelligible class. For it is and it is not, it is nowhere when filled, it is nothing when empty. Hence it is said to be discerned by a kind of spurious or analogous reason, partaking so feebly of existence as to be hardly perceivable, yet always reappearing as the containing mother or nurse of all things. It had not that sort of consistency to Plato which has been given to it in modern times by geometry and metaphysics. Neither of the Greek words by which it is described are so purely abstract as the English word space, or the Latin spatium. Neither Plato nor any other Greek would have spoken of chronos kai topos, or chora, in the same manner as we speak of time and space. Yet space is also of a very permanent, or even eternal nature, and Plato seems more willing to admit of the unreality of time than of the unreality of space, because, as he says, all things must necessarily exist in space. We, on the other hand, are disposed to fancy that even if space were annihilated, time might still survive. He admits, indeed, that our knowledge of space is of a dreamy kind, and is given by a spurious reason without the help of sense. Compare the hypotheses and images of Republic 6:511. It is true that it does not attain to the clearness of ideas, but like them it seems to remain, even if the objects contained in it are supposed to have vanished away. Hence it was natural for Plato to conceive of it as eternal. We must remember further that in his attempt to realize either space or matter, the two abstract ideas of weight and extension, which are familiar to us, had never passed before his mind. Thus far, God, working according to an eternal pattern, out of his goodness has created the same, the other, and the essence. Compare the three principles of the Philebus, the finite, the infinite, and the union of the two. And out of them has formed the outer circle of the fixed stars, and the inner circle of the planets, divided according to certain musical intervals. He has also created time, the moving image of eternity, and space, existing by a sort of necessity and hardly distinguishable from matter. The matter out of which the world is formed is not absolutely void, but retains in the chaos certain germs or traces of the elements. These Plato, like Empedocles, supposed to be 4 in number: fire, air, earth, and water. They were at first mixed together, but already in the chaos, before God fashioned them by form and number, the greater masses of the elements had an appointed place. Into the confusion, migma, which preceded, Plato does not attempt further to penetrate. They are called elements, but they are so far from being elements, stoicheia, or letters in the higher sense, that they are not even syllables or first compounds. The real elements are 2 triangles, the rectangular isosceles which has but one form, and the most beautiful of the many forms of scalene, which is half of an equilateral triangle. By the combination of these triangles, which exist in an infinite variety of sizes, the surfaces of the 4 elements are constructed. That there were only 5 regular solids was already known to the ancients, and out of the surfaces which he has formed, Plato proceeds to generate the 4 first of the 5. He perhaps forgets that he is only putting together surfaces, and has not provided for their transformation into solids. The first solid is a regular pyramid, of which the base and sides are formed by 4 equilateral or 24 scalene triangles. Each of the 4 solid angles in this figure is a little larger than the largest of obtuse angles. The second solid is composed of the same triangles which unite as 8 equilateral triangles, and make one solid angle out of 4 plane angles. 6 of these angles form a regular octahedron. The third solid is a regular icosahedron, having 20 triangular equilateral bases, and therefore 120 rectangular scalene triangles. The fourth regular solid, or cube, is formed by the combination of 4 isosceles triangles into one square, and of 6 squares into a cube. The fifth regular solid, or dodecahedron, cannot be formed by a combination of either of these triangles, but each of its faces may be regarded as composed of 30 triangles of another kind. Probably Plato notices this as the only remaining regular polyhedron, which from its approximation to a globe, and possibly because, as Plutarch remarks, it is composed of 12 times 30 equals 360 scalene triangles, Platonic Questions 5, representing thus the signs and degrees of the zodiac, as well as the months and days of the year, God may be said to have used in the delineation of the universe. According to Plato, earth was composed of cubes, fire of regular pyramids, air of regular octahedrons, water of regular icosahedrons. The stability of the last 3 increases with the number of their sides. The elements are supposed to pass into one another, but we must remember that these transformations are not the transformations of real solids, but of imaginary geometrical figures. In other words, we are composing and decomposing the faces of substances, and not the substances themselves. It is a house of cards which we are pulling to pieces and putting together again. Compare, however, Laws 10, 894a. Yet perhaps Plato may regard these sides or faces as only the forms which are impressed on pre-existent matter. It is remarkable that he should speak of each of these solids as a possible world in itself, though upon the whole he inclines to the opinion that they form one world, and not 5. To suppose that there is an infinite number of worlds, as Democritus, Hippolytus, Refutation of All Heresies 113, had said, would be, as he satirically observes, the characteristic of a very indefinite and ignorant mind. 55c. d. The 20 triangular faces of an icosahedron form the faces or sides of 2 regular octahedrons and of a regular pyramid. 20 equals 8 by 2 plus 4. And therefore, according to Plato, a particle of water, when decomposed, is supposed to give 2 particles of air and 1 of fire. So, because an octahedron gives the sides of 2 pyramids, 8 equals 4 times 2, a particle of air is resolved into 2 particles of fire. The transformation is effected by the superior power or number of the conquering elements. The manner of the change is 1. A separation of portions of the elements from the masses in which they are collected, 2. A resolution of them into their original triangles, and 3. A reunion of them in new forms. Plato himself proposes the question, why does motion continue at all when the elements are settled in their places? He answers that although the force of attraction is continually drawing similar elements to the same spot, still the revolution of the universe exercises a condensing power and thrusts them again out of their natural places. Thus, want of uniformity, the condition of motion, is produced. 57d and following. In all such disturbances of matter there is an alternative for the weaker element. It may escape to its kindred, or take the form of the stronger, becoming denser if it be denser, or rarer if rarer. This is true of fire, air, and water, which, being composed of similar triangles, are interchangeable. Earth, however, which has triangles peculiar to itself, is capable of dissolution, but not of change. 56d following. Of the interchangeable elements, fire, the rarest, can only become a denser, and water, the densest, only a rarer, but air may become a denser or a rarer. No single particle of the elements is visible, but only the aggregates of them are seen. The subordinate species depend not upon differences of form in the original triangles, but upon differences of size. The obvious physical phenomena from which Plato has gathered his view of the relations of the elements seem to be the effect of fire upon air, water, and earth, and the effect of water upon earth. The particles are supposed by him to be in a perpetual process of circulation caused by inequality. This process of circulation does not admit of a vacuum, as he tells us in his strange account of respiration, 78b. Of the phenomena of light and heavy he speaks afterwards, when treating of sensation, but they may be more conveniently considered by us in this place. They are not, he says, to be explained by above and below, which in the universal globe have no existence, 62d, but by the attraction of similars toward the great masses of similar substances, fire to fire, air to air, water to water, earth to earth. Plato's doctrine of attraction implies not only 1. The attraction of similar elements to one another, but also 2. Of smaller bodies to larger ones. Had he confined himself to the latter, he would have arrived, though perhaps without any further result, or any sense of the greatness of the discovery, at the modern doctrine of gravitation. He does not observe that water has an equal tendency towards both water and earth. So easily did the most obvious facts which were inconsistent with his theories escape him. The general physical doctrines of the Timaeus may be summed up as follows. 1. Plato supposes the greater masses of the elements to have been already settled in their places at the creation. 2. They are 4 in number, and are formed of rectangular triangles variously combined into regular solid figures. 3. 3 of them, fire, air, and water, admit of transformation into one another. The 4th, earth, cannot be similarly transformed. 4. Different sizes of the same triangles form the lesser species of each element. 5. There is an attraction of like to like, smaller masses of the same kind being drawn towards greater. 6. There is no void, but the particles of matter are ever pushing one another round and round, periosis. Like the atomists, Plato attributes the differences between the elements to differences in geometrical figures. But he does not explain the process by which surfaces become solids, and he characteristically ridicules Democritus for not seeing that the worlds are finite and not infinite. End of section 3.